Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast, where we navigate our political and cultural divides with a chaser of civility. We invite you to grab your favorite beverage and join us as we explore our differences and build bridges across our divisions. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink and Counterweight podcast. I do not have a co-host on this podcast, and I'm so excited, though, to speak with James Joyce III of Coffee with a Black Guy. And so I don't even have to ask what we're drinking because it's coffee. Yep. So I have to tell you, though, James, I actually grew up all over the world. My father was Air Force, but my family has a home in Newport Beach, not far from you. So when I'm drinking something like non-alcoholic, I try to pick a mug that goes at least as close to where my guest is. So I've got my Orange County Starbucks mug. It's not exactly, where you are at, but close enough, right?
Close enough. We'll embrace them all.
So I've heard about you and Coffee with a Black Guy for a while, and I've been excited, and then things got crazy, pandemic type stuff, and of course those things that kind of drop off. I want to know all about you, and then I want to tell you how I kind of got to know about what you're doing, and we'll just go from there. But tell me first, who is James Joyce III? And let me just tell you, I love your name because my son's name, Finnegan, is from Finnegan's Wake, James Joyce's book, Finnegan's Wake.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that.
So already there's like some connection there. But
I love that.
Okay, who is James Joyce III?
That's awesome. Well, Jen, thank you so much for having me. First of all, I love what you're doing with this, and it's right in alignment with what I've been doing with Coffee with the Black Guy, like really trying to just bridge the divide, get over the BS, and really just build neighbors, build community, right?
Yeah.
Myself, I was born and raised on the East Coast, a little town in Westminster, Maryland, right outside of Baltimore. It's in the Baltimore, DC metro area, about 20 minutes from downtown Baltimore, about, maybe 45 minutes from DC. Predominantly white community, fairly conservative, and understand that Maryland is a Mason-Dixon state, so it's technically still the South. And so it's got an interesting history and legacy that I born and raised in, right? Good place to be from. Went to school at Ohio University, got a journalism degree, had a ball down in Athens, Ohio, ran track down there, got very involved on campus, and really catapulted me into a career of journalism. I started as a daily newspaper reporter in Marion, Indiana, for a Gannett-owned paper. And if you know anything about that, that's where you go and you get your reps in. You get good at the craft. And so I went there, and I could only last about 2 years because I actually went back and looked the other day, and I had in the it was like day to day, 2 years, I had 720 bylines. When you talk about getting reps in and really learning like what the craft is, so I lasted there 2 years, and then really went out into the Pacific Northwest in Yakima, Washington, reporting out there, covering education. And so as a reporter, when you're going to these various communities, you're really having to learn keen observation skills, right? Where you're parachuting into a city, and you have to tell the good, bad, and ugly to the people who were born and raised there in an authentic way on day one, right? That's a challenge. And there's a steep learning curve to do that. But at the same time, that is a great skill to hone in on. Fast forward, got out of Yakima after a little more than 4 years, went to Toledo, Ohio in 2008. That was right around the Obama presidential election, right? I was in Toledo, if you recall that election. There was a guy named Joe the Plumber. Joe the Plumber was about a mile down the street from where I lived. Right. And so we were right in the heart of that and excitement. And I started covering some political stuff because, of course, we were in the territory. And that was like my first time canvassing neighborhoods and all that kind of stuff. Fast forward after the election, get laid off, end up moving out to California. Long story short, end up getting working for a guy who was a city councilman in Santa Barbara, but running for the state assembly seat. And he needed somebody to work for his campaign. I was living in Ventura County, a little closer to Orange County, but I was living in Ventura County at that time. And he needed somebody to work his campaign down there. I ended up getting that job. And, that's when I first started actually doing politics and doing the political thing. Working for a state assembly member, then getting recruited away by the state senator, working for her for all 8 years, Hannah Beth Jackson. She an awesome legislator, probably one of the best and most effective state legislators in our country. Created the Equal Rights Bill, women equal pay for women. That was the first one in the nation, and then it got replicated in states elsewhere and now nationally. Women on corporate boards, she did that bill. Yes means yes for affirmative consent for sexual assault on campuses. Like, these are a lot of like weighty bills that are really kind of leading in the forefront of equity issues, right? And kind of being in that mix, she had a project that was talking about entrepreneurship, and then hatched Coffee with the Black Guy in 2016, right? When it was on the heels of Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. And I'd already known about Coffee with a Cop. I have a fraternity brother who at the time was assistant city administrator down in the city of Hawthorne. And we were talking one day, and he was telling me that, well, we started Coffee with a Cop. Like, man, whatever. Like, and I like that challenge. I was just like, man, you're trying to claim everything. And then I did my research, and I was like, oh, snap. Well, Coffee with a Cop started in Hawthorne, California. And when I was doing my research, I'm like, they started what is Coffee with a Cop based on the fact that they wanted to humanize the badge. It'd be seen beyond their uniform. And there was something that resonated with it. I was like, well, shit, I want to be seen beyond my uniform too, right? Like, this is what I can't take this off, right? And so Coffee with the Black Guy is like, we should just have Coffee with the Black Guy. And I kind of hatched and incubated the idea. And then Philando Castile and Alton Sterling. And I saw people who I was normally interacting with. I was district director for the state senator. So I'm in these rooms interacting with people, kind of, known in town. And people are no longer having those conversations. They're no longer actually even looking me in my eye, because that's what's dominating the headline. And I'm like, this is very inauthentic. We can do better. And so then I just kind of said, all right, well, I'm going to have Coffee with the Black Guy, posted it on social media. People responded heavily on social media. And so I thought that wasn't going to be enough space at the coffee shop. And so there was a co-working space in town that I had been working with. It was called Impact Hub at the time. And they agreed to host me. And for the first 2-3 years of Coffee with the Black Guy, pretty much every session was at one of their locations, which they would host, donate the coffee, all that kind of stuff. But it was really just about bringing folks in, facilitating conversations, and just being real and building community and getting to know various perspectives, because I think that's the value in this whole thing. It's just the perspective. It's not about trying to convince anybody or try to wash folks into this anti-racist wave, but it's about really making genuine connections and really having an opportunity to ask the tough questions that you may not otherwise get a chance to ask.
I want to tell
I really dove in there. I'm sorry. You told me to come over. I just told the whole narrative.
That's exactly where I wanted you to go. So I'm sorry, I was looking down at my notes. So if I interrupted you, I wasn't looking. But I wanted to say that's one of the things that's so attractive about that is, for our audience, I knew of you before this event, but I was reminded of the work that you were doing because you and I work with Irshad Manji in the Moral Courage College, and you were a part of an event that she did, an online event that she did with Cal Balvin. And I saw your name again. And then it was like, wow. But what you just said rings so true to everything that's important to me, because it's all about the engaging versus assumptions. And so when we don't engage, we are left to our assumptions, and that is often negative. But you said something that I wanted to touch on, because this is how I kind of got into this questioning, and particularly questions around race. Is you said that, after the incidents that you mentioned and the violence that you mentioned, people became inauthentic. And this is what I do with Irshad Manji and the work that we do with Moral Courage. But I think that it's because of the way we have done some of the anti-racism work, some of the diversity work that we've done, and this is what Irshad's trying to do to change it, is it comes from a place of judgment and shaming and blaming. And so people just end up closing down instead of having the honest conversation. And there is some guilt in there, I'm sure, and some of it, legit. But then there's also that, you don't bridge divides by silencing people. And so that's what I'm hearing. That was your MO, right? Or that was your reason for.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll point out, Ibram X. Kendi in his How to Be an Anti-Racist book, because of his bout with cancer, he made the great parallel that I had been using for years. And when I read it, I was like, that's the perfect vehicle to carry that, right? Is that, racism is like a cancer in our country. And until we really get down to the root of it and address it and get it out, then we're not going to move forward. And for me, ultimately, we can have the conversations, but ultimately those conversations are going to have to lead to an action. And right here in the state of California, we're on the forefront again of taking some of those actions in really having serious conversations about reparations, right? And getting to the root of, okay, let's look at the harm of slavery that created the economic foundation of our country, and the series of systems that were put in place since then. And I've heard folks say pretty much slavery had lasted up until about 1975. So because of the implications of Jim Crow being a vestige of slavery within itself. And so, looking at the impact of social, economic, all the impact on a rate, with looking at that through a racial lens, there's an argument and there's a conversation that seriously needs to be had, because there's a lot of harm that's been done. And if we are looking at, our quote unquote criminal justice system, and that criminal twice was intentional, right? When we look at what happens with incarceration, it's supposed to be the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, right? But that we know that doesn't happen, but that's supposed to be the mindset. On the front end, we look at the whole idea of restitution for a wrong that's done. So all of these things are already embedded within the systems that we set on, but we fail to apply that when it comes to the original harm and the original sin that built that whole thing, right? And so I think that looking at it as a cancer, you can't just look away from a cancer, because it's going to metastasize, right? And we've seen that, and we continue to see that in many ways. And there's all the conversations are good, but again, they need to lead to action.
Yeah, for sure. And a lot of it just stops at the Twitter feed, right? I mean, there's that.
For now.
For now, but not with us. That's why I wanted to talk with you. And there was something you mentioned, something that I want to address, because this is a conversation I'd love to have. And I don't know that from the way you just explained it, that we're on the same page, but so I want to hear more. But I'll give you a little background before I ask my question. So I attended the City of Austin's DEI training, and it was not what I expected. I expected it to be something like this, where I got to listen to voices that weren't my own, listen to histories that weren't my own, generate that empathy, generate that understanding. And it really became what I mentioned earlier, a shame and blame game. We had to sit down, and I actually wrote an article on it. We had to sit down and map out white traits, this was a couple of years ago. And it was just confusing to me. And the facilitator said, this is neutral. It's not good or bad. But I was sitting around a table with people who were like saying all these things, violent, rapists. And I was like, that's not neutral to me. That's, and, I think that, sure, but I think that applies to anyone. And so it really became, I'm okay with discomfort. I just thought that it wasn't the right way. It wasn't a conversation. It was, I just felt like I was sitting in a chair and it was like this. And I was like, well, I left from it not feeling like I gained any understanding or knowledge. And when I did ask, because I was the one who was always asking questions, I'll never forget this. Oh gosh, James, it really pissed me off. I was asking a lot of questions because I was curious. That's why I went to the event.
Engagement.
Yes, and no one was engaging. It was talking to. And I remember I asked a question, and this young white woman, and I don't like to categorize people, but for the sake of this discussion, she sat there and she furiously wrote notes, and she sent me, she passed over quietly a note, and it was this list of books, and she goes, Black people are tired of talking to white people. You need to do your work. And I was like, because I had been reading my stuff. The reason I was there was I was doing my work, right? Mm-hmm. And so I felt that to get a real experience, I can read the books, but if I'm not having that real experience, if I'm not listening to your story, how am I, then I'm doing the work. And it made it so the fact that you're out there, even if we don't always agree on things, which I'll get back to what I think we might disagree on. It made me, that was a very frustrating experience for me because there was no engagement. There was all assumption.
Right. Well, that's a beautiful story, and everything that you hit on it is exactly why Coffee with the Black Guy has kind of grown into what it is as a business, right? That, that's the pitch I give, is that, like, you can read the books, you can, watch the documentaries, you can have the implicit bias training where people lecture you, but what Coffee with the Black Guy offers is an opportunity to unpack all of that where the rubber meets the road. How do you apply that to your life, right? And really stop thinking of these DEI things, performative things as kind of one-off, but really infusing them in a lifestyle, like a religion. And just like a religion, every week you go back to the house of temple to be able to kind of rejuvenate for the work that you're supposed to do throughout the rest of the week. And so that's why these kind of conversations are important, right? And so like you're absolutely right. And I'll say that the woman who said that to you, she's right too, right? Based on what she saw, just a snapshot of she drew an assumption because there was no engagement, and then she delivered a message that I agree with. Like, right, there's a lot of people out there that need to do their own work, but then they also need an opportunity to unpack that work. And that's where the void was for you, is that you just didn't have an opportunity to undo, to like, it didn't meet your expectations, right? And I think that a lot of times, institutions, they're afraid to go and address the real uncomfortable stuff in an authentic way. They don't know how to address it. They don't know how to lean into that uncomfortable. And, the reality of it is you kind of heard my trajectory across the country, right? I've lived in areas that I stand out, right? There's areas in those communities where I could go and have comfort and all of that kind of stuff, but I've had to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable, right? And so that's why I feel like, this is not only just a business, this is a passion project for me, because I feel aligned with purpose in saying that, okay, I've experienced a lot of BS. Like, I've seen Klansmen eye to eye as a kid in their little teepee hats, and was like, I didn't know what they were, right? And so that's been a lived experience. And to see the fear on my mom and my grandmom's face, and how they had to pull off on the side of the road after that encounter happened, and like regroup and explain to me that these men are bad men in those uniforms. I call them costumes, right? Because you look like clowns. And
they are.
But anyways. But at the same time, and I was at a young kid, and to kind of fill in the back end of that story, we were at a red light, and this was in like Manchester, Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
on the way to Baltimore County, and there's these men in these teepees. I don't know, I may have been early 12, 13, maybe, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And these men in the teepee hats were standing at the red light, like holding signs. I don't know what the signs said, but they were just kind of waving at the crowd. And I looked the dude in the eyes, and like we connected eyes, and I waved and he waved back. And it was like, it was a human connection. And like, that's what I was connected on. And then I felt the vibe in the car, and my mom and grandmom and everybody's just looking straightforward and just like, quiet and tense, waiting for the light to change. And as soon as the light changes, my mom doesn't even speed away. She just slowly hits the gas and pulls away. We get down the road a little bit, and then she, boy, don't you ever put your hand down. Like, don't, like, and I'm like, what's going on? And then she fills me in on the backstory, and I'm like, oh, okay. Like, they're bad men, I guess. Okay. But you can't deny that like, you know, who doesn't, what adolescent male doesn't come up thinking that he's made a connection with somebody based on eye contact, right?
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, that was a real human connection of like,
Right.
there was no direct hate that happened in that exchange that I felt. You know what I mean?
Interesting.
So to me, that like, there's areas of opportunities. And then I learned, I can't recall the gentleman's name, but he's known as like the clan converter. The guy, the black gentleman.
Yes, Daryl.
Daryl, yes.
Yes, and I forgot the last name. Starts with a D. Yes. Uh-huh.
Learning his story and the work that he's doing, I'm like, that aligned, with like, yeah, somebody's got to do that. Not everybody agrees with, sitting down and giving folks of diverse backgrounds, including white folks, an opportunity to ask questions and pick and probe and be subject myself to microaggressions and all that kind of stuff. Like, I know that that's not for everyone, but somebody's got to do that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? Because if somebody doesn't do that, and we get to the end of this whole conversation with the action of reparation, and then nobody's been having those conversations, there's going to be a bigger divide in the lack of understanding. There's not going to be any buy-in, and there's going to be resentment. And at this point, I think we're heading that way.
Yeah.
As far as reparations. When I first started Coffee with a Black Guy, I did not think that reparations were going to be like, I started Coffee with a Black Guy because I thought that reparations are never going to happen. Like, this is like, America is never going to do that. But in place of reparations, what America has done is they've laid out these business structures that can allow you to create a vehicle for generational wealth. And essentially, that's the purpose of reparations, is to equal out generational wealth. And so I started this as a business, as opposed to a nonprofit, because of that concept, behind that concept of building something that is of value. Not saying that nonprofits aren't, but people cognitively value things differently in a business transaction than with a nonprofit.
That's interesting. Now, okay, let's reparations was what I was going to talk to you about. I need to give a little more context, but the context is, I'll try to be brief. After that event that I told you about, I wrote an article saying that I thought that we were doing this wrong. I care so much about getting this right, and I thought that from this event that I went to, I thought we were doing it wrong. And I got a reply. It was in Ariel magazine, and a Black attorney from San Diego wrote me, and we started writing each other back and forth, really long, in-depth letters. And by the way, that book it's now a book that'll be published. It's coming out in October. It's called
Awesome.
Letters in Black and White. But here's the deal. So we started talking, and one of our chapters and one of our discussions throughout is reparations. And so I'm, as I'm trying to work through what I feel, because of course, you can't deny history. At the same time, I grew up in a place where, I just, in the military, there's not the same, what's the word I want to use? There's not the same segregation as there is, maybe out in the public. So it's all new to me. So I'm struggling with this stuff. So we're having this conversation again. It's part of the book. And he is absolutely just disgusted with the idea of reparations, because he's like, how can you put a price on a life? The other thing that's important to him is what we haven't done in this discussion around race in America. And again, this is something that we talk about, is there's so much Black resiliency, Black strength, Black, so our part 2 of our book is these unsung heroes, right? People who were like making the money, who are making, and who built like Black Wall Street, which I know, Black Wall Street also was destroyed, but, made their fortunes and these just Black communities that were so awesome. And his deal, his letters to me, or what he's disappointed in, is the way that we talk about race now creates this sense where Blackness is oppression, nothing else matters. And if that is how we are teaching our young Black children, that the system is always rigged, it'll never change, system, you might as well just accept it and fight the power. He's like, we're losing the battle. So that's basically the premise of the book. So reparations. I mean, what do you think about his take on reparations, that, you can't put a price tag on a life?
I agree with that statement. But that's not what reparations is. It's not putting a price tag on a life.
Tell me more.
It's about the labor, the free labor, the systems of oppression that have continued to deny the ability to build generational wealth, right? So you just talk about Black Wall Street. I'm glad somebody is focusing on the positive of that, right? All we hear about that is the destruction. But I want to know more about why they wanted to destroy it, right? Like how did that happen to become such a threat that it had to be burnt down, according to the people who did, right? So I think that's a valuable area to be in. But it's really about building that generational wealth. So look at a family who owned enslaved people, and then the people who were enslaved, the family of those who were enslaved. And you look at the opportunities that were afforded to individuals who were enslaved after emancipation. And then you saw, what was that, the Reconstruction era. You saw Black political participation, Black business, Black ownership, and then that became a threat and got burned down. And then systems were put in place to keep that from happening again, right? And so it's not so much a life, because there's no way to put a value on that. Like, I mean, you can't, like, what about all of those lives that were lost in capturing people on the mother continent, then all the lives lost in transport during the Middle Passage, right? And then all the things culturally, genetically, historically, that were stamped out and killed during that process, right? And then what you talk about is the resiliency, is what's left, right? What was able to prevail, what stuck around, what saw through all of that. And I don't want to get into a conversation on eugenics, but like it's like, well, geez, they're dominating sports. Kind of by design, right? You wanted the biggest and best to do that work that was for free, right? And so when you look at like cotton as a commodity, all the work that went into that, and the reason that it was able to trade and at the rates that it was, and people were able to build wealth for their families, was because of free labor that was on the backs of other people. And so it's not about, the value of a life. It's a value of that whole thing. and you can't fit that in 140 characters on Twitter, right? So that's why the conversation's got to happen.
Right. Well, and I don't disagree with you. Here's what I'm struggling with, though. So I don't have a lot of numbers, in front of me, but most people outside of some of the big, the Rockefellers, like the, crazy, wealthy, ridiculously wealthy people. I mean, generational wealth usually doesn't pass down past 3 generations on average is the number that I've heard. So, you look at like the South, where after, during Reconstruction, there was a lot of, and I am not like giving a pass or thing, but I just don't know that there was that much wealth that was built up. I think there was a lot of wealth destroyed in slave states on the white side as well. And so I'm just wondering if the generational wealth, and I think that we should be doing things to equalize, but I'm just not sure that argument is, I don't know that even if we didn't have the Jim Crow, whether or not that would necessarily have changed and be a case for reparations. Tell me more, convince me more.
1619 Project, the Warmth of Our Sons, or 1619 Project, Nicole Hannah-Jones, Warmth of Our Sons, Isabel Wilkerson, and Cast by Isabel Wilkerson.
Yep.
Case 1, 2, and 3 for reparations. And if you need a primer to that, Ta-Nehisi Coates, he wrote an article for the Atlantic in 2014, making a case for reparations.
Yep, right.
All the work has been done. I don't need to recreate that argument per se, because they do a great job of that in there, and laying out the historical linkage to the economic divide. And again, when I say it's not just about the generational wealth from slavery, looking at, okay, so then after that, what about redlining, right? Where Blacks could only buy in certain lower valued neighborhoods, right? They couldn't invest, even if they could afford to, right? Because some had military money, right? Because of that, if they could afford to invest in other parts of the city, but they weren't allowed to because of redlining, right? And that was an intentional thing. And it's still happening in some places, through racial covenants and various other things. But, it's very tough for me, it's very tough to make an argument that says that there's not an economic divide that falls fairly clearly along the race line.
Yeah, well, okay, on that note, let me ask you another question that touches on that. Would you say, and you're right, I mean, that's just a fact, right? I mean, there's no denying that fact. Would you say, though, this is a question that we talk about a lot. Some people will boil it all down to systems. Would you say that it's all about systems, or would you say that there's more than, it's not always about systems are one reason, but then there's other factors as well? Would you say about that?
Yes, and.
Yes, Urshad Manji, or she's like both and.
Right. I think it's systems, but then what makes up systems? People, and the people's biases influence the policies that systems put out, right? And so when the work that we're doing is changing those people who make up the system, right? Broadening the perspective of the individuals who make up the system, and then you change enough of those, and then the system starts to change. It's incremental change, right? It's not going to be radical change, but that's kind of how this democratic experiment has been set up. It's not set up for radical change; it's set up for incremental change. And so, I think tamping our expectations of that would do us well. But at the same time, like, you heard, like, I started off with, like, I didn't think reparations would be even a reality in 2016, and here we are, 5+ years later, and I came to the conclusion, like, well, this is probably going to happen. Like, there's, the ball is rolling, right? And, when I say that, I'm looking at, California, the first country, or the first state in the nation to have a task force a legislative task force to study reparations. And just just yesterday, they voted to like what that would look like, right? Or not what that, who would be eligible. So, communities of eligibility had been the conversation for the past 2 months exclusively in these task force meetings. The task force was created by the legislature, signed by the governor, to be able to present a report to the legislature by July 1st, 2023, on what reparations would look like, right? There's been kind of similar, but has been watered down, but similar legislation at the federal level that's been introduced since 1986-ish, called HR 40, that could do the same thing at the federal level, where the conversation should be happening. California shouldn't be bearing the weight of figuring this out for the whole nation, yet here we are. But I think that looking at how things happen legislatively, as you heard me kind of point out earlier, the work I did for Senator Jackson, and seeing how that is kind of model legislation, I think it does make sense for California kind of to work some things out. California tends to be a legislative petri dish. We figure it out, economy of scale, close to 40 million people, and then the rest of the country can utilize and adapt to as it fits, in various regions. But we won't know until we have that conversation seriously. And the commission that would be formed under HR 40 and the task force that's been meeting and doing the deep work and really vetting these issues and having experts do testimony. And one of the previous Coffee with the Black Guy conversations I had in February was on reparations 101. And we had the chair of the California task force join us for that conversation, in addition to someone from Human Rights Watch, who's in charge of their U.S. programs. And so really dissecting it in a community conversation way. And again, like you said, a lecture can be off-putting. Yeah, we called it Reparations 101, a community conversation, right? And so it's still just, just having coffee, having a conversation, and that's, coffee, connection, conversation.
And you know what my tagline is? Searching for context through correspondence and conversation. So yeah, connection, context. I mean, that's what matters. So okay, I've got on that note. I'll just keep asking because I'm very curious. So let me ask you, I've got two questions still on the reparations side.
Sure.
What in your mind, and I know you're only one person, I know we've got to come together as a community to make it work, but what in your mind do you think the majority of the Black community would say, yeah, if that's how things were done, we'd feel that there was justice? Is there, I mean, and again, I know you cannot speak for everyone, you can only speak for yourself, but what do you think would be like kind of a baseline that people would go, yeah, we'd get on board with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, a baseline is stop fighting critical race theory, or whatever they want to call it. I mean, it's a misnamed thing, but reparations isn't just about the check. The check is critical to that. And then when I say the check, I'm looking at, it can come in a variety of forms, a down payment on a house, free education, universal health care, whatever. But that financial element needs to be key and paramount to reparations, but also you need a parallel track of education and bringing people along. And you really need to have that understanding, right? And it's not new model, right? Look at how Germany has made monument of the Holocaust and made sure that they're never going to forget. They teach it. They don't ban it from being taught in schools, right? They address it, understand it, and so, okay, so that's what's not going to happen again, right? And you look at racial reconciliation process that happened, in South Africa with apartheid and the anti-apartheid movement, and how restorative community efforts were paramount to making sure that moved forward. Same idea and same situation.
I think that my understanding, or at least the people that I speak to, and I know, again, there's a diversity out there, those who have a problem with critical race theory, it's not the problem with teaching history. It goes back to what we were talking about, the way the kind of the shaming and blaming, and there's a sense that we're resegregating by putting people in back in boxes, Black, white, Hispanic. And so we're just playing the same game as before and reversing roles. And so I think that, at least, and that's how I would feel. I don't feel that it's, I don't have a problem with the theory. And in so many ways, I mean, it's true. It's true. I mean, this is where I think critical race theory gets some things right. I mean, you look at the way we did desegregation, right? And we put it on and this goes to the question of systems. They put it on the books, but what ended up happening was, because they were busing all of the Black children more to white neighborhoods, Black teachers lost their jobs. And if people would have realized and actually had that relationship and said, oh, and actually realized what would happen on the ground interpersonally, instead of just coming down from the top down and going, this is how we're going to do it. And this is an example of a system, right? And so really they made a legal change without a heart change. And so stuff like that, I do agree with.
But that ties back. The reason, okay, so what you just point about, a lot of Black educators losing their jobs. Well, then look at our current teaching corps and the folks that we're supposedly tasking with teaching, quote unquote, critical race theory. I'll get to that in a second, because it's a misnaming it. Yeah, critical race theory. I think that might be it. Is ivory tower stuff. What they're talking about is just historical accuracy. And I mean, it's just convenient to call it critical race theory, but when you have a teaching corps that's ill-equipped to teach that content, then of course you're going to be against it. If you had if you had teachers who were teaching algebra who didn't know any, didn't have any numerical recognition whatsoever, then you'd probably have a problem with the content coming out of that class. Right. And so, I don't think the problem is so much with the content. It's about the carrier of that content. And so what's that mean? Beat the drum about diversifying our education corps, right? Getting more teachers who, all of these TikTok creators who are creating all this awesome content, get in the damn classroom. Right. And what would happen if the National Education Association, or whatever the Teachers Association, came out with an MOU with TikTok creators who wanted to get into the line of education, because most schools prohibit you from identifying your school and doing all that kind of stuff, social media activity but creating some sort of MOU waiver where TikTok creators not only are in the classrooms, but they can still create content and then create something different in getting that information out. Now, of course, there's got to be a vetting process and certifications and all that. Not every TikTok creator is created equal. Those who have to do, their research and be, anchored in truth. But, thinking innovatively is American as American pie. And so we need to stop shying away from that and lean into that innovation and figure this shit out.
Yeah, I think with returns to critical race theory, I think we should just say, I mean, we just need to teach history. That's that you talked about terms, and I think that's where people get mixed up. I mean, to me, I think, why don't we just say history? Let's just teach history.
Here's an example of historical accuracy. So when youth are taught about George Washington being the founding father of our country, right? They're taught that, this whole myth about chopping down a cherry tree and signing this and doing all of that. But the part that's left out is that both he and his wife owned slaves, and the whole denture situation about, at the time, dentures were made out of other people's teeth, and people were property at that time. So George Washington had enslaved people's teeth in his mouth as dentures. Now, what's wrong with telling that whole story, right? The whole arc of who that character is and more, right? that's more accurate than just the myth, right? And that kind of goes against cancel culture, right? You can't be judged by your worst deed in that same idea and philosophy. And so, like, we got to have some understanding and some grace. But like, when you really look at, like, because of this whole Will Smith, Chris Rock thing, there was a Chris Rock interview that he did back in January with Neil Brennan. And I went back and watched that the other day, and oh my gosh, like, Chris, yeah, these guys are entertainers, but like, they're smart individuals. They're researched and individuals. And so, like, he's talking about his family's relationship with racism and why his family moved from South Carolina to New York because of some racial violence that may or may not have happened in South Carolina, but racial violence was the norm, right? People went missing, right? That was there was a lot of dark things that happened and continue to happen that we have not and do not address. And so if we want to tell this whole story, we can't just paint the positive picture, right? Like, this whole push, everybody is talking about therapy and healing their trauma now. America needs to heal its trauma, address the trauma that has happened. All of those lynching photos that used to be passed around as postcards, like, yeah, there was one Black body hanging from the tree, but there were hundreds of white eyes watching that, and that were captured in that photo. That's a traumatic experience to witness and normalize and to pass around as a postcard. And so when you look at violence in America, there's a lot of trauma that's rooted in America that needs to be healed.
So on that note, would you also then say, I mean, and I don't disagree with you, but when we talk about honest history, I mean, that would be, I mean, honest against both the good and the bad, both Black, white, and all colors. So, I mean, if we're going to go there, then we can talk about, honest history, good, bad, and ugly for, Black history, good, bad, and ugly for white history. I think that we still, I mean, I personally believe our founding fathers, the ideas that they had, I still think are worth preserving. How they did it, different story, right? And so I have no problem teaching honest history. Here's where I, though, have a problem, and I don't believe in literally and figuratively whitewashing history, but where we're teaching, if everything is taught from a narrative of oppression, if we're teaching history and we've got to teach George Washington's teeth were, made from slaves, or teaching history and we've got to be like, that person did that, and always point out the oppressor oppressed narrative, then again, we get to the students who I care so much about. I care so much about getting this right, where they're just like, well, F the system, F this world. Why is it's not even worth preserving? Burn the system down, because it's always going, I'm always going to be in that role. That's what I worry about.
And you just gave an explanation as to why that doesn't happen.
Why?
Because that's a reality. When you and Black America's been saying that for decades. F the system. Mm-hmm. You heard it in hip hop back in the early 80s, right? And you've heard it ever since. You've heard it back in music, pop music back then, right? Like, that's a reflection of the frustration of knowing that full arc of the story, and having and being gaslit when you bring it up. Like, when you bring up your individual incident of racism and then tie it to something systemic, that you're making a big deal out of. It's not that. It's not racism. Why are you always pulling the race card, right? That was always the retort when those things were brought up. But that's been the reality that Black America has seen. And so you're right. The reality is, as everyone learns that real history, we've been part of that arc of better understanding. Very well may end up being burning it down and starting from scratch. But it's a process.
I think even Isabel Wilkerson, right, would say, if I remember Cass right, I mean, the structure is like, you don't burn down the house, right? I mean, you still, or maybe I misunderstood her, but I believe, and that's one of the things that I liked about that book was, I think that people who are talking, I think that there's good things worth preserving, and burning down the house. And that's where I get fear, is when we're teaching only from that angle, then of course people are like, burn down the house, because you're not seeing anything worth preserving.
But here's the beauty of this beautiful thing that has been built by our founders. We have the amendment process, and we can utilize that to improve the thing without burning it down. And so we don't need to recreate the wheel. We need to just go back and do the work and look at the political division that is masked as, our country, red versus blue and all that kind of stuff. Like, there's division is always going to happen, but the fact that that body of Congress can't get things done is a problem. Like that's a problem. And then it's like, oh, so why do you have to make it political? Well, the problem with being Black in America is your humanity is politicized. You don't have a choice, right? And so, like, yeah, teach me the whole story. You know what? I wish they would have taught me about Nat Turner when I was in school, right? That's supposed to be the bad story of Black folks. Oh, rebellion, blah, blah, blah. Shoot, there's a reason I didn't know that, right? Like, had I known that, there might have been some lessons that I've learned that would have taken from that and then applied on my argument with the administration at my school, and something might, I was accused of being a militant leader anyway. My friends used to joke after Spike Lee's Malcolm X movie came out. They were like, "You changed after that, James. You changed."
You just said something that I wrote down because I thought it was really important. And we don't agree on everything, which is love. I love that, because I love having real conversations. But this is something that really struck me. Your humanity is politicized. And I that's absolutely, that hit home.
Yeah. No, that's real. I mean, like, okay, so folks want to make memes and make jokes and talk about this whole, Chris Rock, Will Smith slap at the Oscars. But like, that's another example of humanity being politicized, right? That's alopecia. That's a pain. Like, I've known people that have lived with that, and there's a shame that goes with the whole hair thing, let alone I've only known men who had alopecia. I have not known women who openly have shared that they have alopecia. And so I know that there's a different connection there with women in their hair. So there's that's a thing that is real pain that is essentially being politicized, right? And for how many people who actually experience that in their real lives, like, how are they feeling right now about their, a pain that they can closely connect to being so politicized? Well, that's what happens on a daily basis with Black folks, right? Where you see hashtags of, oh, George Floyd, and I can only imagine how the Floyd family feels now when they go anywhere and have to tell people, oh, excuse me, what's your name? Floyd. Oh, are you, you know what I mean? Like, that's been politicized. Your humanity has been politicized. And those are just some accessible examples, right?
I hope that you and I can have this conversation more frequently, because it's so fun for me to be able to have someone to talk to, but also speak in good faith, even across differences, but then to model that too, because I think that, again, people are afraid to question and learn from our differences. I can't wait for when I'll send you a copy of the book, and then maybe we can have a discussion around that too. I would love to get your feedback and your but even before then, I mean, I think I'm leaving a lot on the table. I want to be conscious of our time, but there's so much more I'd love to discuss if you're open.
And that for your listeners, that's why I'm available for bookings, right? Because these conversations, we can have this here, but suppose you want to have this within a group of moms have a book club, and they're like, you know what, put your money together, because I value my time. I understand my worth, right? And so that there needs to be an exchange of value there, and doing your work beforehand. But these conversations have to happen. And, I want to know more about what we don't agree on, because I genuinely being a reporter really has given me the understanding and the perspective to be able to say, for most anything that happens, I can understand where other people are coming from. And that's what the beauty of being Black in America gives you, kind of that perspective, right? But it's a thing that should be shared, those who are willing.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I care so much about getting it right. That's my thing. So, that's for sure. I mean, I think we found plenty of common ground, but for me, it's just the praxis of how we do it that matters. And it takes moral courage.
Yeah. Right back to that. Irshad Manji.
Yeah, I have to, I work with her. I got to plug that. But speaking of plugging, so why don't you tell our audience how to find you, so that if they want to book you and have their own coffee with a Black guy, it's CWABG.com, coffeewithablackguy.com. Yep. And on the website, there is all the resources.
Yep. So, kind of gives you a snapshot of what the movement is and what we've been up to. Got a YouTube channel that's got plenty of, previous conversations. And so there's accessible free content out there. But there's nothing like consuming content and engaging in an interactive experience. There are two totally different things.
Totally different things.
And so, you can go to the website and reach out to me via the email option there. Engage on social media. I'm on all the not all the platforms, but Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn.
As CWABG?
On Facebook and Instagram, and I think on Instagram or on Twitter, we are Coffee W Black Guy. At Coffee W Black Guy. Okay. And so, can reach out and engage there. But really enjoy having these conversations. They're tough. It's emotional labor. I bring my authentic self and encourage everyone who comes of any diverse background to bring their authentic selves to the conversation as well, and just unpack it. And that means sometimes you're not going to get it right. Sometimes we're going to get it wrong. But the idea is, as community, we work through that wrong as well, and we figure it out together.
Yeah, and it's so much. I mean, it's a constant process, right? It doesn't stop with one conversation.
There's a hashtag I like to use: keep the conversation going. Right, because it's a continuum.
And it's creating, in order to have those conversations too, we have to create that trust, and that trust is only created through engagement. So
and some ground rules, some basic rules of engagement. And the reality of it is, when I'm kind of taking it back to the root and history of this, as I started doing research after I started Coffee with the Black Guy, I did the research. What's the history of coffee? And I found out that it originated from the Ethiopian, Somali, northeastern African region, and that it started because, long story short, the berries fell. The goat herders saw that their goats would act differently when they would eat the berries, as the legend goes. And then they realized that there's some power in these berries. They started to, brew them and grind them. And then there was this ritual that was built around this coffee that was brewed from these beans, right? And that ritual became a thing. And then that thing, when you talk about rules of engagement, so as tribes were in the area, were conflicting with one another, their leaders would come together, have coffee, discuss, how can we avoid this? Is there, can we talk about this first instead of going to war? And if we have to go to war, what are the rules of engagement, right? And that was all done over a coffee conversation. And you see that same process replicated today in the Middle East, as our troops would go in and meet with the tribal leaders. They have tea, same ritual, same exact ritual. But why are we trying to act like we don't have the blueprint to solve these problems? We do it elsewhere.
Well, I think the blueprint is engagement, and I hear you with ground rules too, but that's not where we're. I mean, we've that genuine engagement has dropped off. So I appreciate what you're.
And for Coffee with the Black Guy, the basic ground rules, and I'm pulling out my handy dandy Coffee with the Black Guy notebook. Also on the webpage, we have merch. So like the shirt, the hat, the mugs, all that stuff. It helps facilitate the conversations, right? As you're on your DEI journey in your place of work, and you have to keep notes, keep it in one of these things. And then as you're at the coffee shop reading through your notes, someone might ask you, Coffee with the Black Guy, what's that? No matter who you are, it's going to start a conversation. But when I'm talking about rules of engagement for Coffee with the Black Guy, it's basic. Be respectful, be genuine, be willing to listen. An important one, be willing to feel something, and don't seek to dominate with your story, which means you're sharing and you're listening, right? And so those are some, like, it's not rocket science, you know, we're just having authentic conversations. And again, there's models out there about doing it. We just need to lean into that uncomfortable.
Yeah. Well, thank you for leaning in with me. Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show and check out the show notes to see what each of us is reading. Different news with different views. You can find us at holdmydrinkpodcast.com, all major podcast platforms, and on YouTube. Or subscribe on Substack at truthinbetween.substack.com so you never miss an issue. If you want to join our Discord community, drop us a line. And until next week, may your conversations be constructive and your divisions diminished. Cheers.